Carbon is very unique. It has 4 valence electrons, which allow it to successfully bond covalently in many different combinations. Because of its small size, the nucleus can hold onto the bonds much more securely than other elements. In the video that's playing right now, you can see an example that I drew of a covalent bond with carbon and hydrogen, forming hydrocarbons, which makes up many macromolecules and fossil fuels that we use to survive. Covalent bonding, especially with carbon, is super important for all life on Earth, especially since life on Earth is based on carbon, and most carbon molecules primarily rely on covalent bonds to interact with other atoms. This bonding also allows more complex combinations that result in important compounds such as carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids that most of us rely on to survive. And other common elements are made, such as carbon dioxide, methane, and coal. This first picture showing is of fullerene, the purest known form of carbon. Next are pictures of carbon-containing macromolecules, such as proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids that we eat and consume every day. There have been over 1 million carbon compounds discovered, with more studied every year. Carbon forms compounds that make up around 18% of all organic matter in living things, and is extremely versatile, mostly because it can form chains, branch chains, and rings when bonded to other carbon atoms, as well as form single, double, and triple bonds. This makes it super practical and common in the natural and artificial world, and we use it every day in life. Depending on the configuration of a carbon atom, severely different materials can be created, like granite that is very soft, compared to diamond, which is extremely hard, but they still remain as allotropes of carbon. In diamonds, carbon bonds are strongly bonded to 4 adjacent carbon atoms located at the top apices of a tetrahedron, forming a 3-sided pyramid. This forms a strong, rigid, 3-dimensional structure, or pyramid, that can be recreated infinitely, as well as being highly compacted and have more density. In comparison, graphite is a layered structure that consists of rings of 6 carbon atoms arranged in widely spaced horizontal sheets. That forms a hexagonal system. Each carbon atom is bonded to 3 other carbon atoms, and this forms a horizontal hexagons and 2D layers. The distance between each layer is farther than the distance between carbon atoms in each layer, which allows electrons to move much more easily within planes. There are 4 important types of macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, also known as fats, protein, and nucleic acids. Each has a special function that we use to survive. Carbohydrates can be found in sugars, fibers, and starches, and are stored as starch or glycogen, which we burn for energy. Lipids, or fats, can be found in animal meat, dairy products, and cocoa butter, and are primarily stored in adipocytes, which are specialized fat cells. Organisms often store these fats for later in case of food scarcity or an emergency. Protein mostly comes from meat, fish, eggs, dairy products, seeds, nuts, and legumes. They are stored in muscle, bone, skin, hair, and most body parts or tissue. It's used to strengthen and construct cells, body parts, and plant walls. Nucleic acids are mostly found in all cells and some viruses, and are stored in the nucleus of plants and animals. Nucleic acid carries genetic information, such as DNA, that living organisms use to mature and survive. Since macromolecules are a subset of organic molecules, and organic molecules are comprised of any carbon-containing liquid, solid, or gas, their fundamental component is carbon. Since carbon can uniquely bond to as many as 4 different atoms simultaneously, it can become the basic structure component of macromolecules. This is important because macromolecules provide many crucial survival functions, including structural support, a source of stored fuel, storing and retrieving genetic information, and speeding biochemical reactions. There are 6 elements that are necessary for life: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. These are also referred to as biogenic elements. All living organisms contain organic molecules, which are different combinations of these 6 biogenic elements. To be considered organic, a molecule must contain a hydrogen-carbon bond, which is shown in the picture. However, inorganic molecules such as water or carbon dioxide allow a living organism to survive, but do not have a hydrogen atom. Carbon is incredibly vital to the 5 other biogenic elements because it can covalently bond in countless ways. Biogenic elements need a hydrogen-carbon bond to be considered organic, and carbon is required to construct most biogenic combinations. According to their position in the periodic table, silicon and carbon are very similar. Both have 4 valence electrons and can form 4 chemical bonds. Since valence electrons in silicon are farther away from the nucleus, silicon bonds are less stable and cannot store as much energy. The bonds also disintegrate and become unstable in water and cannot form as a gas on Earth. Comparatively, carbon has 4 valence electrons in its second shell, which allows the atom to have much more stable covalent bonds. These bonds also store much more energy in the form of glucose, and when combined with oxygen, silicon forms an incongestible solid compared to oxygen that forms carbon dioxide, which plants rely on. An important example of a chemical reaction central to life is photosynthesis. Its chemical equation is 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water molecules with sunlight create glucose and 6 oxygen atoms. 6 carbon atoms and 6 water molecules are taken in through the atmosphere en route. Photons, also known as sunlight, activate electrons, which causes a water molecule to be split into hydrogen and oxygen atoms. The charged electron from the photon is then passed to the photosystem II, filling empty ATP carriers. The energy and hydrogen atoms are then sent to photosystem I to convert NADP plus to NADPH. ATP and NADPH are then sent to the stroma for glucose production through the Calvin cycle. When glucose is produced, it is stored as energy to fuel the plant's survival. When a plant or living organism needs energy, a glucose molecule is split. This releases stored energy, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The more bonds there are, the more energy can be used for survival functions like digestion. To make photosynthesis, plants absorb carbon dioxide. It is also required for producing and storing fuel in the form of glucose to construct plant walls and membranes, which are also used to fuel consumers, like cows. Photosynthesis and carbon have supported life since the beginning of living organisms. To understand possible livable conditions outside of our planet, scientists have relied on carbon to measure the plausibility of photosynthesis and whether or not we, or a probable living organism, could survive in an extremely different climate. Photosynthesis has also been used to study the effects of climate change on plants and how they could be possible climate solutions. To make photosynthesis, plants take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water from the soil. When the water molecules are split into hydrogen and oxygen atoms, oxygen is released from the stomata into the air, then consumed by living organisms, like mammals, reptiles, and birds. Carbon is also released in the atmosphere through evapotranspiration and root respiration. Since Earth is a closed planet and atmosphere, the amount of carbon does not change except for its location in the cycle. Some carbon is stored in rocks and sediments, while the majority is in the ocean atmosphere and in living organisms. Carbon is released through the burning of fossil fuels, volcanic eruptions, wildfires, deaths of organisms, and in many other ways. Specifically, carbon is regularly exchanged between the surface of the ocean and atmosphere and is often stored deep underwater. A specific example of an animal recycling carbon is cows. Since cattle are made to digest cellulose from plants, they can consume grasses and other plants that are high in cellulose. Through enteric fermentation, cows digest the carbon-containing plants, aka cellulose, to upcycle it for growth, milk production, and other metabolic processes. Cows often burp out methane as a byproduct of consuming plants, which return that sequestered carbon back into the atmosphere. Once the methane is broken down and converted back into CO2, plants can use it to perform photosynthesis and produce cellulose. An incredibly important plant example is sphagnum moss, also known as peat moss. They create and dominate most boreal peatland ecosystems through their ability to sequester large amounts of carbon in the soil. When rates of growth exceed those of decomposing moss, more carbon is stored. As photosynthesis kicks in, carbon is taken in by the moss while also being released into the soil through decay and root respiration. In tundra climates, the carbon is continually stored underground by the moss over thousands of years, but with warming temperatures will likely be re-released into the atmosphere. This plant is important in efforts to tackle the climate crisis and continues to prove its practicality in climate solutions.